Preston Wilder had broken a great many things that belonged to him and never once been handed the bill. A sports car wrapped around a guardrail, a housekeeper's silence, the thin bones in his fiancé's wrist. He decided long ago that Nora Bennett was one more possession that came with his name, and possessions did not get to flinch. He was still pressing ice to his split knuckles when the knock arrived. 3 slow, patient strikes against the door of his Park Avenue penthouse, timed as evenly as a second hand, landing precisely at midnight. On the other side of that door stood a man Preston had only ever heard, named in the careful, dropped voices of people who mattered far more than he did. And the man was smiling the way January smiles at something already frozen. "You put your hands on what's mine," Damiano Vitale said, and let himself in without waiting to be asked. "Let's discuss the interest." Rewind 11 hours, and Nora Bennett was setting her own wrist in a locked hospital bathroom, biting down on a rolled towel so no one would hear. She was a night shift nurse at St. Newan, Oberon's on the Upper East Side, and she knew exactly what she was looking at when she peeled back her sleeve. The distal radius snapped clean, the swelling already blooming purple beneath the skin. 6 years of trauma bays had taught her hands to be steady even when the rest of her wasn't, so she braced the joint against the cold porcelain lip of the sink, breathed out slow, and reduced the fracture herself with a small wet click that made her vision go white at the edges. Then she splinted it with tape and a tongue depressor from the supply cart, pulled her sleeve down, and went back out to finish her rounds. She told the charge nurse she'd tripped on the ice outside. The charge nurse, a kind and tired woman named Grace Molina, who had been Nora's only real friend for 4 years, looked at the splint, looked at Nora's face, and said nothing. Because she'd learned that pushing only made Nora fold the door shut faster. Grace knew. Grace had known for months. She just didn't have a name yet for the thing Nora went home to. The thing had a beautiful name. Preston Wilder of the Greenwich Wilders, whose family money went back far enough that no one asked too closely where the first of it came from. He was handsome in the smooth, unfinished way of men who'd never been told no. And when he'd first pursued Nora, plain, wide, invisible Nora, drowning under her mother's medical debt, she had mistaken his interest for a miracle. Her father was dead. Thomas Bennett had run an honest accounting firm on Lexington until the year everything came apart, until the fraud charges that were never his, until the ruin that took the business, the house, and finally his heart one gray morning, all at once. The Bennetts had been rich enough, once. Then a man Nora had never met reached into their lives and hollowed them out, and they'd been broke and frightened ever since. So when Preston Wilder offered a ring and, with it, a private cardiac facility for her failing mother, Nora had said yes with both hands. She'd been young. She'd been desperate. And desperation, she would come to understand, is just the leash you buckle on yourself. It took 3 months for the charm to wear thin enough to see the wiring underneath. The first time he grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise, he'd cried afterward and blamed his father, and the pressure and the wine. And she'd believed the version of him that wept because the other version was unthinkable. By the 6th month, she'd stopped believing anything and started managing, reading his moods like weather, learning which words were tripwires, keeping her mother's monthly invoices at the front of her mind like a hostage's photograph. Margaret Bennett could not afford for Nora to leave. That was the whole architecture of the cage. Every blow had a price tag, and the price was her mother's beating heart. Tonight's tripwire had been a rumor. Someone had told Preston that his fiancée had been seen 2 weeks back, walking out of St. Oberon's after her shift, flanked by 2 men in dark coats. Men whose faces belonged to a world Preston liked to pretend he only touched at a distance. He'd worked himself into a white-lipped fury over it, over the imagined disloyalty, over the intolerable idea that anything of his might have a life he didn't control. He hadn't asked her who they were. He'd simply taken her wrist in both hands at the door of the penthouse and twisted until it gave. He didn't know who those men were. That was the joke of it, the joke that would end him. Nora knew. 6 weeks earlier, a little after 3 in the morning, they had brought a man into her bay, bleeding from a hole in his side that had not come from any accident. She'd been alone at the desk when the doors banged open. 2 men half carrying a third. all of them soaked in the specific silence of people who did not want to be a story. The wounded one was gray and losing fast, and the two holding him up were watching her the way animals watch a road, calculating whether she was danger or exit. Hospital protocol on a gunshot wound was carved in stone. Stabilize, then call the police, no exceptions. Nora looked at the wound, and she looked at the men's hands, and she looked at the thing in their faces that told her exactly what a police report would cost this man in a holding cell before dawn. And she made a choice her father would have recognized. The choice to read the whole situation instead of just a rule. Trauma 2, she said. Now. And nobody's paging anyone until I say. She worked on him for 40 minutes. She packed the wound and got a line in and kept him breathing, and when the surgeon on call arrived, she'd already logged it quietly as a deep laceration from a fall onto rebar at a construction site. A lie clean enough to hold offered to no one who'd asked for it. The wounded man lived. His name, she'd learned much later, was Enzo Marchetti, and the man he answered to did not forget a debt any more than he forgot an insult. When the two codes came to collect him the next night, the older one had stopped at her desk and looked at her with something like grave courtesy. "You could have made a call that killed him," he'd said. "You didn't. That gets remembered." She'd told him she was just doing her job. He'd told her, in a voice like a door closing gently, that in his experience, nobody was ever just doing their job. And then he'd gone. She'd thought it was over. She hadn't understood that in certain quarters of the city, a life saved is a marker held, and that markers like that get watched over. She didn't know that for 6 weeks there had been on and off a car she never noticed parked with a view of the Wilder building. Not because anyone wanted her, but because the man who owed her had decided without asking that the nurse who'd saved his enforcer's life was owed a roof of protection whether she'd requested one or not. So when Preston broke her wrist at the door that night, there was a man in that car who saw her come home flinching, saw the way she cradled her arm, and made a phone call. And at midnight, Damiano Vitale knocked 3 times. Nora didn't learn what happened in the penthouse until the next evening, and she never learned all of it. And she decided not to ask. What she knew was this. Preston did not press charges, did not call anyone, did not leave his apartment for 4 days, and when he finally emerged, he had the careful, folded-in movements of a man reminded of his own mortality by an expert. And she knew because Damiano Vitale came to find her at the end of her shift, waiting outside St. Spurston, Oberon's in the sodium wash of the streetlights, and told her the rest himself. She'd built him in her head out of rumor, the way you build a weather system you've never stood inside. The man against the streetlight was quieter than the rumor and worse than it, both at once. Tall enough to make the doorway behind him look temporary, charcoal coat, no rings, a stillness that came off him like cold rolling off a frozen river, the kind of calm that isn't the absence of violence but its patience. He didn't loom over her. Somehow, it was the opposite. The noise of the avenue seemed to step back and lower its voice around him, the way a room goes quiet the half-second before something breaks. "Miss Bennett." His voice was low and unhurried and did something unfair to the back of her neck. "I owed you a debt. I've adjusted it. I didn't ask you to hurt anyone." "I know. You never ask for anything." That's part of what got noticed. A muscle moved once at the hinge of his jaw. "He won't touch you again, but a man like that heals his pride the way a coward does, quietly, and then all at once, from behind. So I'd like to make you an offer, and I'd like you to actually hear it before you say no." The offer was strange enough that she made him repeat it, his protection, openly, in the city's face, his name spoken over hers, which in his world was a wall no one climbed. Her mother moved that week to a facility that didn't send invoices to people like the Wilders, a set of men between her and a fiancé whose pride was healing wrong. And in exchange, nothing he'd name. Her presence, her honesty. The chance, he said, to stop being something other people spent. "Why?" she said. "You've cleared your debt. You gain a broke nurse and a scandal." For the first time something surfaced under the frozen calm, and it was old and tired, and she'd understand this only much later. A grief of a different vintage than her own. because I spent my whole life around people who take from women exactly like you and call it their right, he said. And once in a long while I get the chance to make one of them regret it. You saved a man of mine when the rule book told you to let him die in a cage. I find I'd rather have you on my side of the board than watch you get spent by the other. He turned to go, then paused without looking back. Your father was Thomas Bennett, the accountant on Lexington. It wasn't a question. The men who ruined him are the same men whose money runs through the family your fiancé serves. In case you ever wondered whether the two halves of your bad luck were connected, a beat. They are. Good night, Miss Bennett. He was gone before she found her voice. She stood under the streetlight with her splinted wrist held against her chest, and for the first time in 3 years, the enormous gray, helpless thing she carried everywhere turned over in the dark and showed her its other face. It wasn't grief. She'd had enough grief. It was appetite. She went to him 3 days later, on her own 2 feet, and she did not go to be protected. You said the men who took my father are tangled up with the Wilders, she said, standing in the study of a house that sat behind a high wall in the Hudson Valley, all dark stone and long cold windows. I want a name, and then I want a way to reach it. Damiano watched her from behind a desk that had belonged to men colder than he was. The name at the top is Cesare Bruno, he said. He runs the family that's been circling mine for a generation. 11 years ago, he wanted a clean accountant to sign off on a set of numbers that would launder a great deal of dirty money and look, on paper, like honest loss. Your father said no, so Bruno arranged for the fraud to have Thomas Bennett's name on it instead of his own, took the firm apart, and let the shame do the rest. He said it flatly, without drama, which was somehow worse than any drama. Preston Wilder is a small man who married into that money's orbit and thinks it makes him large. Hurting you was Preston's idea. But the reason you were broke enough to be within his reach at all, that was Bruno's. Nora was very still. Somewhere far down, her father's kitchen table voice came up through the years. The padded invoice is always the one nobody reads twice. He'd taught her and no one else, because there'd been no one else. She was an only child, and she'd inherited his eye for the lie a column of numbers tells when someone leans on it. I read money for a living, she said. Same as he did. Whatever Bruno's washing, it moves through books, and books can be read. Point me at them. Damiano looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face that had been braced for a frightened woman quietly rearranged itself into something closer to respect, and maybe further than that. You understand what you're asking to walk into. I've been walking into it my whole life, she said. I just didn't have the map. Give me the map. The armor came before the ledgers, and the armor was a fight. Damiano's world had rules about appearances, and one of them meant Nora could not move through it looking like a woman who'd spent years being told to make herself smaller. He brought in a stylist for her, a precise man named Fabian Cross, with beautiful taste and terrible instincts. And Fabian took one long look at Nora and began murmuring about clever vertical seams and structured panels and something dark and forgiving to quiet the middle. Nora felt the old flinch start up in her shoulders. Preston's voice and Preston's mother's voice and 100 department store mirrors. Damiano listened to exactly 9 seconds of it before he raised one hand and stopped the man cold. You'll dress her in whatever makes her look like what she is, he said. And if you can't see what she is, I'll find someone whose eyes work. What she was, the clothes finally admitted, was a threat with a pulse, deep oxblood silk, the color of old wine held to firelight. Cut not to hide a single inch of her, but to make every inch look deliberate, chosen, unafraid. She walked into rooms in that color and watched people recalculate. She had spent her whole adult life being looked past. She discovered she had a talent for being looked at that no one, least of all herself, had ever suspected. And she watched Damiano in the slow way she watched everything. That was the burn, and it was slow, and it did burn. He gave her nothing for weeks but courtesy and distance and a care she didn't understand and didn't trust. Then one sleepless night she came down to find him in the unlit study with a photograph he wasn't meant to be caught holding. His father, dead 11 years, and not gently. He didn't hide it. He moved over on the leather bench, and she sat, and neither of them spoke, and the not speaking turned out to be more dangerous than any confession. Over the following weeks, he gave her the truth in pieces at strange hours. A man who'd inherited a machine built by crueler men and spent his life trying to steer it somewhere with less blood in it, and mostly failing and paying the private toll of failing. The rumors had him monstrous. What she found underneath was something more unsettling than a monster. A man who had chosen over and over to be only as terrible as he had to be, and who had never once in all those years had a single person see the choosing. She saw it. He knew she saw it. That was the beginning of the end of both their armor. She went into Bruno's books the way a diver goes down past where the light gives up. Damiano's reach got her what she needed. Records from a shell that Bruno ran onto the skin of a legitimate thing. A charitable foundation that funneled money through a network of clinics and a hospital board chaired by a woman named Eleanor Prescott. Nurses' instinct and accountants' eye braided together into something neither alone could do. Nora sat for 11 days with cold coffee and the specific, savage joy of a hunt she was built for. And she found the lie the numbers told when Bruno leaned on them: phantom patients. Procedures billed and never performed. Grants that walked in one door of Prescott's institution as charity and walked out the other as clean, spendable cash. Millions a year, 3 years deep, all of it stamped and blessed by a corrupt board that answered, through 2 soft layers, to Cesare Bruno. First strike, she said, laying the pages across Damiano's desk like a hand of cards. We can't touch Bruno yet. Reach for the head, and he vanishes into his lawyers, and we spend a decade proving nothing. But this washes his money. It's the pipe. Prescott is the valve. Burn the valve, and the man on the inside who keeps it running has to improvise. And frightened men, she said, and her father was somewhere in the room when she said it, always improvise badly. They took Eleanor Prescott apart in 9 days, and they did it with paper, which pleased Nora more than any gun could have. She rebuilt the fraud into something a federal auditor could read over a single cup of coffee scrubbed clean of anything that led back to the Vitale house. And Damiano made certain the right envelope reached the right desk at the right regulator, and the right reporter on the same gray Monday. By Friday, Prescott's board seat was ash, her institution was frozen mid-audit, and Eleanor Prescott herself was explaining her charity to men in cheap suits who did not care how much hers had cost. The valve was shut, and somewhere in Bruno's operation, Nora knew, a careful man had just felt the floor tilt, and was reaching for something to steady himself that would give his whole hand away. The retaliation came from Margaret. It came the way the truly cold things come. Quietly, at the soft place on an ordinary Tuesday, Nora was at the new facility watching her mother do a crossword with more color in her face than she'd had in a year, watching her ask again where that nice Preston had gotten to, learning again the small daily cruelty of a mercy lie. She'd stepped out for coffee when the floor nurse mentioned, in passing, that a man from facilities had come by to check the oxygen lines in Mrs. Bennett's room. A man with the right lanyard and the wrong walk, who'd asked a little too precisely which room was hers. Nora put the coffee down without drinking it and moved. She reached her mother's door in time to see him at the foot of the bed, while Margaret dozed. Mid-40s, gray coat, a face built to be forgotten, a syringe sliding from his sleeve. And here is the thing that the men who read Nora Bennett as furniture never once accounted for. Before she'd ever been a Mafia boss's marked woman, she had been a night shift trauma nurse for 6 years, and she knew this kind of floor down to its bones. She knew that the clear line already running into her mother's arm was a door someone could walk through, and she knew better than any assassin alive exactly what was in the crash cart against the wall, and precisely how fast the code team came when the red button screamed. She hit the button and threw the crash cart into the back of his knees in the same motion. The man called Kane was a professional, and professionals do not improvise well against noise and light and witnesses and a nurse who does not scare. He got the needle half raised. He did not get it into the line because the room was suddenly full of alarm and running feet, and because the fat soft, Invisible woman he'd been briefed to expect had instead driven 100 pounds of steel cart into his legs and was screaming a code loud enough to bring the whole floor. He made the professional's only correct choice and ran empty-handed for the stairwell, straight into the arms of a Vitale soldier named Vince Ricci, who had been posted at that facility for 2 dull weeks on Damiano's quiet order and had been praying for exactly this. Vince did not let him leave. Damiano arrived 40 minutes later, and Nora had never seen the frozen calm break before, and she watched it break now. He took in his marked woman standing over an overturned cart, with her chest heaving and her mother safe and confused behind her, and something behind his eyes came off its chain. What Kane gave up to Vince in that stairwell was a name, the name of the man on the inside who had panicked when the Prescott valve burned and reached for the softest target he could find to send a message. There was violence that night, out past the city, in the rain. Nora didn't watch it and didn't ask. Damiano came home near dawn with rain in his hair and something that wasn't his on one cuff, and stood in the bedroom doorway braced to be recoiled from. She crossed the room and took his cold face in both her hands, the whole one and the splinted one, healing now, aching only a little. "You went out into the dark," she said, "and did something terrible to a man who came for my mother." "Yes." "Good." And she kissed him. It was not gentle. It was 2 people who'd spent months stacking a wall out of caution, watching it prove worthless in a single night. He made a sound against her mouth like something unlocking after a very long time held shut, and his hands closed around her, the way a drowning man closes around the only fixed thing in the water. But careful. Even now, careful, because she'd taught him she could break things, and he still handled her like she was worth not breaking. When they finally came apart, she pressed her forehead to his and felt him shaking. This man the whole city feared. Shaking because she had stood in a room with a killer while he was somewhere else. "Gave me the name Kane gave you," she said, into the small warm dark between them. He told her. Renzo Fontana, Damiano's own underboss. The man he'd have died for, the inside hand who'd been feeding Bruno for 3 years, dressing theft as loss, and who had understood, before anyone, that a nurse with an accountant's eye was the single most dangerous thing to ever walk into that house. Damiano would very still, not surprised, grieved, the stillness of a man watching the last person he trusted turn into a stranger in front of him. "Then we finish it," he said. "But we finish it clean, and we finish it in front of witnesses, and I want Bruno alive at the end of it. Not dead. Dead is a mercy and a war. I want him ruined in the light, watching, the way he made your father watch." His eyes found hers, flat and dark and, for the first time, a little frightening. "And she found she didn't mind, and I want you at the head of the table when it happens, because he looked at your family 11 years ago and decided you were something to be spent. I want the last thing he understands to be how completely wrong that was." The reckoning happened at the sit-down, and Nora ran it. Salvatore Conti called the meeting. The aging consigliere who'd loved Damiano's father and had spent 3 months deciding whether Nora was the best thing to happen to that house or the last. He'd made up his mind the night of the crash cart. Now he convened the family's leadership at the stone house to address the unrest, the burned charity, the assassin, the war everyone could feel gathering. And Renzo Fontana came, of course, because a guilty man who refuses the room confesses by his absence. He came in a beautiful suit with a beautifully grieving face, and he embraced Damiano, and he shook his head at the tragedy of it all, at the audacity of the Brunos, at the terrible position it put the family in. He was good. He was so good that if Nora hadn't spent 11 days living inside his fingerprints, she might have believed him. She wasn't meant to speak. Wives and women didn't at that table. That silence was the whole trap, and it sprang shut on Renzo because no one had prepared him for the moment she rose from her seat against the wall, walked to the head of the long table, and set a folder down in front of every capo in the room. "My husband asked me to walk you through some accounting," she said. Her voice was clear and cold and in no hurry at all. "I did this for a hospital for 6 years before I did it for a family. It turns out the work is identical. You follow the money to the sick part, and you cut." She did not raise her voice once. She followed it page by page, the way her father had taught her at a kitchen table long turned to dust, out of the family's shipping accounts and through the false losses and into the Bruno charity. 3 years of it, flowing past exactly one desk signed off by exactly one careful hand before it ever reached Damiano. She laid down the phantom patients, the washed grants, and then the last page, the one that had cost her 3 sleepless nights, a wire confirmation dated the very week the Prescott valve burned. A panic payment routed from Renzo's hidden account to the handler of the man who'd walked into a cardiac ward with a syringe. He sent a killer after a sleeping woman, Nora said, and now she was looking only at Renzo, and the whole room had stopped breathing. Because I got close to his money. That's all my mother was to him. A message. She let it land. You looked at me and saw a soft thing that would break under the first hard word. Everyone at this table who bet the same way should study my face, because you're going to want to remember it. Renzo tried. Of course he tried. The wrong length laugh, the appeal to old blood, the sneer at the sentimental spasm that had made the boss marry a fat nurse and hand her the books. He looked around the table for one friendly face, and found instead a row of men who could add reading the pages in front of them, looking at Renzo Fontana the way you look at something you've discovered living in the walls. Salvatore Conti closed his folder with 2 soft, ancient hands. He looked at Nora for a long moment, and then he inclined his head. A small, complete bow, the verdict she'd waited 3 months for the old man to reach. I've decided, he said to her quietly. You were the best thing to walk into this house in a generation. Then he turned to Renzo, and every warm thing left his face. And you were the last thing that will ever walk out of it a free man. They took Renzo Fontana out into the rain. Nora did not go with them. She'd been offered the choice, and had turned it over, and decided that watching a man die would not give her father back, and that she'd rather remain someone Thomas Bennett would still recognize. But she stood at the long dark window and watched the cars roll down toward the wall, and she did not look away, and she felt no sorrow at all. Ending Cesare Bruno took 2 months, and Nora savored every day of it, because a man like Cesare, the architect, the one who'd looked at an honest accountant and his young daughter 11 years ago and seen only a name to hang his crimes on, could not be shot into ruin. He had to be dismantled the way you bring down a load-bearing lie, one careful pull at a time, until the whole edifice came down on the man who'd built it. And the tool for it was the same tool that had unmade Prescott and Renzo. Paper. Money. The truth of where it walked. Nora, now the undisputed mind behind the Vitali accounts, did to Cesare Bruno precisely what he had done to her father. She built a case out of paper and made it perfect. Working through the reach of the family and her own relentless, patient reading, she assembled the entire architecture of the man. The laundered charity, the phantom clinics, the funding of a quiet war, the payment to the man who'd sent a killer to a hospital room, and she traced all of it past Renzo's silenced hand, back to the Bruno accounts that had received it. She could not put Cesare in a grave without lighting the city on fire, so she put him somewhere he'd find worse. She put him in the light. The same regulator who'd frozen Prescott received a second, larger gift. The same reporter got a second envelope, and this time the trail didn't stop at a corrupt board. It climbed clean and undeniable and impossible to bury all the way to Cesare Bruno's own name on his own accounts, receiving stolen money through a charity built on fake patients. The Bruno family, which had spent a generation staying carefully in the gray, was dragged into the white glare where men like Cesare do not survive. His allies scattered. His protection evaporated the instant he turned from an asset into a liability. And Preston Wilder, whose family fortune had been quietly braided into Bruno's laundering for years, and who had never once suspected that the wife he'd broken could read the very ledgers that damned him, went down in the same wave, his name on the front page beside the word fraud, and beneath it, dragged into the daylight by the anonymous record of a hospital admission he'd forced her to lie about the word abuse. He did not heal his pride quietly and come at her from behind. He didn't get the chance. She'd taken it. Camilla Ashford, the icy socialite who'd once loudly wondered at a gala whether the caterers had thought to plan for Nora's particular appetites and whose family had bet everything on Bruno money, found the invitations drying up overnight and discovered exactly how thin a woman becomes when there's nothing left behind her. And Cesare Bruno himself, stripped of his fortune, abandoned by his people, facing indictments in 3 jurisdictions, got one visitor before the walls closed for good. Nora went alone. She'd earned that. She sat across a bare table from the man who'd hollowed out her family 11 years before she ever knew his name, and she folded her hands, the wrist long healed now, strong, and let him look at her. Really look. At the woman he'd decided, a decade ago, was nothing but a soft place to press. "You're wondering how," she said. She could see it moving behind his eyes. "A man like you always needs to know how the small piece did it." She let the silence stretch, the way she'd been taught. "You made one mistake, Mr. Bruno. It's the same one they all made, right down to the last of them. You looked at me and decided what I was, and then you stopped looking. My father used to say the padded invoice is always the one nobody reads twice." She stood, unhurried, and buttoned her coat. The oxblood coat, the color of old wine and older resolve, cut to fit her exactly. His name was Thomas Bennett. You put your crimes under his name and let the shame kill him. I put your crimes back under yours. Every last one. I just made sure you'd be alive to read them." She paused at the door. "Enjoy the light. I hear there's a great deal of it coming." She didn't slam the door. She closed it softly. Soft was worse. They married in the spring, above the river, and this one was real. Not for the city, not for a debt, not for a plan folded behind anyone's ribs, for themselves in a garden with the water going gold below. With Margaret Bennett, strong enough at last to walk her daughter across the grass, well enough finally to have been told the whole truth and to have wept it out in the daylight instead of the dark. Grace Molina, the one friend who'd seen Nora's worth back when the whole world looked straight past her, stood beside her and cried without a shred of shame. Enzo Marchetti, the man whose life she'd saved when a rule book told her not to, stood at the front like a pillar holding up a roof. And Salvatore Conti, who had decided, spoke the vows over them in a voice gone soft with age and certainty, and added at the end something not in any ceremony in the old language that Nora didn't need translated, because a blessing reads the same as everything else if you know how to look. There'd been another fight with Fabian Cross weeks before over the dress, some clever architecture to draw the eye up and away from the middle. Damiano had listened to 9 seconds of it, the way he had the first time, and stopped the man with a lifted hand. "You'll dress her like what she is," he'd said, "or I'll find a man who can see it." What she was, the dress admitted at last, was a woman who had walked into a burning house on her own 2 feet and walked out wearing it as a crown. Deep garnet silk, the color of a jewel held to a flame, cut to hide nothing, lit from below by candles so that she seemed to rise up out of the light rather than merely stand in it. She did not look like a woman apologizing for the room she took up. She looked like the room had been built to hold her and had been waiting. At the reception, under strings of small warm lights with the river going dark and honest below. Damiano pulled her close and put his mouth near her ear. And there was rain starting again, soft on the canvas overhead. "They'll tell a different story about you now," he murmured. "The people who used to whisper that I keep a soft little nurse for a wife, they'll whisper something else. That the Vitals have a mind at the head of the table who can read a man's whole life out of his ledgers, and that the last 4 people who mistook her for breakable lost everything they had, one after the next." His hands spread warm across the small of her back. "It's a useful story, it happens to be true. Let them tell it," Nora said, and rested her head against the chest of the man the whole city feared, who had turned out to be the one weapon her enemies never saw coming. "Just make them get one part right." "Which part?" "That nobody saved me." She looked up, and the candlelight sat in her eyes like something that could take a city apart if it chose to. "A man broke my wrist because he thought I was a thing he owned. And I said it myself, in a locked room with my own 2 hands. Then I stood up, and I learned to read the money, and I took every last one of them apart from the inside." She smiled, and it was the softest and most dangerous thing in that whole bright tent. You didn't rescue me, Damiano. You just had the good sense to open the door and get out of my way. He laughed, low and real, the sound of a man who'd stopped being afraid of the one person he probably should have been. Outside, the rain came down over the river and over the city and over the ruin of every man who'd made the same small error. One after another, right down to the last one in the light, they had all looked at Nora Bennett and decided she was a soft place to press. And every one of them had learned, far too late, that the quiet woman they'd overlooked had been reading their whole rotten arithmetic the entire time. They underestimated her once. It cost them their money, their names, their freedom, and in some cases, everything they were. So remember that the next time the world decides you're too soft, too small, too easy to break, the ones who get counted out have a way of being the ones still standing to do the counting at the end. If a fierce heroine who sets her own bones and takes her own crown is your kind of story, do me a favor and send this to someone who needs to hear it tonight. Tap, like so. More people find her, subscribe so you never miss the next reckoning, and tell me down in the comments, whose door would you want the Mafia boss knocking on at midnight?